Welcome to Family Storytime. I'm Miss Camille, and this is Black History Month. As you know, this month we are featuring lesser-known figures in Black history, and today we will be learning about Robert Smalls. He was the first Black captain of a U.S. military ship, but before that, he was a runaway slave who managed to steal a Confederate ship right from under the noses of the Confederacy. And we'll learn just how he did it in The Escape of Robert Smalls, A Daring Voyage Out of Slavery, written by Jayan Jones Radowski and illustrated by Poppy Kang. On the evening of May 12, 1862, Charleston Harbor echoed with the sounds of dusk at the docks. Men murmured to one another as they retired from a long day's work. Crickets chirped, water lapped against ships. But underneath the peaceful concert was the thump, thump, thump of Robert Smalls' racing heart. Robert Smalls was born into slavery. Enslaved people were considered the legal property of another person. Almost 4 million Black people were enslaved at the time of the Civil War. They had no rights. They lived and worked in brutal conditions. They received no pay. The atmosphere was tense on that dark, foggy evening. The Confederate Army was fighting against the Union Army. Southern Confederates wanted to secede from the United States. Slavery was legal in the South, and those states wanted to keep it. Union troops from the North fought to keep the U.S. together. The Union wanted to outlaw slavery. The Union Navy was blockading Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate ships, forts, and soldiers were on guard. They were ready to protect the city from enemy attacks. Charles Relia was the captain of the Confederate steamship Planter. He decided to take a break for the night to visit with family. As on many other nights, Relia left Robert Smalls in charge. Captains were supposed to stay on their ships. They were expected to be ready to sail at a moment's notice. If Relia were caught, he could face a court-martial. He might lose command of his ship. Smalls saluted Relia and the other white officers as they left the Planter. Smalls knew Charleston Harbor as well as anyone. When he was 12 years old, Smalls was sent by his owner to look for a job in Charleston. He worked at the waterfront, performing many different jobs on the boats. While he worked, Smalls carefully watched the crews and learned their responsibilities. He earned $16 a month, but most of it went to his owner. Smalls negotiated with his owner to keep a small amount for himself. In 1861, Smalls was hired as a crew member on the Planter. He quickly mastered skills such as line handling, knot tying, and getting underway. He learned how to secure ships at the docks with ropes and chains. These skills would help Smalls as he moved up the ranks. Smalls worked hard to memorize the ship's routes. He learned where the hazards existed in the harbor, such as sandbars under the surface of the water. Because Smalls was enslaved, he was not recognized as the ship's pilot, but he performed these duties regularly. His highest position was wheelman. As the wheelman, Smalls steered the ship. On a typical night, Smalls would clean and organize the ship for the next day. But tonight was not a typical night. Smalls was preparing to carry out a dangerous plan. Smalls' crewmate said that he had gotten an idea to steal the Confederate steamship months before. Smalls had stood near the wheel of the steamship one day. One of his crewmates put a big straw hat on Smalls' head. Someone joked that he looked like Captain Relia. Both men had short, stocky builds. They folded their arms in a similar manner. Smalls began to carefully observe Relia at the helm. He took note of the captain's movements. He memorized the signals required to pass checkpoints. He studied how Relia moved his hands on the wheel. He copied the way he tilted his hat. He practiced until he was able to mimic the captain perfectly. On May 12, 1862, Captain Relia had left that very hat in one of his uniforms on the ship. Around 3 in the morning on the 13th, Smalls donned the captain's uniform. He pulled the wide-brimmed straw hat low on his forehead. He hunched over the wheel like the captain did. He was ready to put his training to use. The spring night sky was inky black. Fog filled the air. Seeing where the sky ended and the murky waters began was almost impossible. The conditions were perfect for Smalls' escape. Smalls and the rest of the crew were taking a big risk. They would steal a Confederate ship and sail it towards the Union blockade. If all went as planned, they would eventually enter Union territory. No person had done this before. They would pass armed forts where soldiers were on alert. They would risk their lives, all for the chance to be free. Smalls enlisted the help of other enslaved crewmen. He planned to bring their families to freedom, but there was a great risk involved. Steamboats make lots of noise and smoke as they move through water. Sneaking unnoticed past the forts would be impossible. Because they couldn't sneak, they'd have to boldly sail right under the Confederates' noses. The planter would file a 10-mile route. The beginning of the voyage would take place within view of General Ripley's headquarters. General Ripley was the commander for Charleston. He was in charge of military vessels in the harbor. They would need to pass several Confederate forts. Soldiers with guns would be standing guard. They would be ready to shoot. Only when the planter passed those forts would they have the chance to enter Union-controlled waters. Smalls knew they would need to act quickly once the planter approached the Union fleet. Union forces might mistake them for enemy soldiers and fire on them. There was danger on all sides. If caught by the Confederacy, Smalls and the other runaways would be punished harshly. The Confederates relied on the planter. It was used to transport personnel and supplies to the forts around the harbor. In fact, the planter had just been loaded with artillery the previous day. 200 pounds of ammunition were on board the ship, plus guns and cannons. The weapons were supposed to be delivered to forts later that day. The Confederate military would rather sink the planter than see all those weapons land in enemy hands. Smalls would rather use the weaponry to fight to the death than allow himself to be captured. The families of the crewmen waited in secret at the North Atlantic wharf. Smalls' wife and children were among them. They hid inside another boat at the wharf until the planter arrived. Years before, Smalls had tried to buy his family's freedom. At the time, he didn't have the money, but now he was enacting a new plan to gain their freedom. If they succeeded, the reward would be priceless. As the crew prepared to set sail, two of the crewmen became very frightened. Runaway slaves were often whipped. They could be sold into harsher conditions or even killed. The two men decided to leave the ship. The remaining 7 crewmen worried. Would their departing crewmates give away the escape plans? But Smalls carried on. He ordered the crew to prepare for departure. They piled wood into a stove to boil water and produce steam. The steam created energy to move the boat. On the deck, the crew hoisted the Confederate flag and the South Carolina flag to maintain their disguise. The planter set off toward the North Atlantic wharf, moving in a different direction from its typical route. Luckily, no one seemed to notice. The steamship paused at the wharf. The crew members' families sneaked off the boat they were hiding in and climbed aboard the planter. A total of 16 runaway slaves were now aboard. The steamer cranked, hissed, and whistled as it got underway. Every time it made a noise, the passengers held their breath. They prayed no one noticed anything suspicious. Smalls steered the boat towards Fort Johnson. It was the first of 2 heavily armed forts they would pass. The crew steeled themselves for whatever was to come. Fort Johnson was about 2 miles away on James Island. To the planter crew, that distance felt like 2,000 miles. The fort had cannonball-firing mortars and soldiers on guard. The soldiers were armed with guns. As the planter sailed close to Fort Johnson, the crewmen braced themselves for gunfire. They crouched and covered their heads, waiting for cannonballs to pound the ship. But the guards at Fort Johnson were tired. They noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The planter sailed past the fort safely. The crew quietly celebrated. Fort Johnson was their first big test. But as the planter sailed on, Smalls' crew noticed a Confederate guard boat ahead. The guard boat monitored activity in the area. The crew of the guard boat had no idea the planter carried runaway slaves. Smalls remained calm. He stood in the small cabin atop the planter and saluted the other captain. Then he tugged at the rope to sound the whistle as they passed. Smalls even shouted a greeting to the pilot. The planter crew had succeeded again. The biggest challenge still lay before them. Soldiers at Fort Sumter looked out for suspicious activity. They were instructed to destroy any enemy vessels. Fort Sumter was where the first shots of the Civil War had been fired 13 months before. The fort was surrounded by walls that reached 50 feet above water. Loaded cannons were all around. The planter was due to pass Fort Sumter at about 4 in the morning. The hour was early enough that Smalls and his crew would still be disguised by the dusk. It was also late enough in the morning that it wouldn't be suspicious. The soldiers would assume the planter was setting out on its typical business route for the day. Up ahead, logs floated in the water, blocking the planter's path. Smalls had to steer the ship very close to the walls of Fort Sumter to avoid them. The people on board the planter held their breath, terrified. One person said he felt as if he was a rabbit in front of a dog. Some of the crew fell to the deck. They covered their heads, expecting cannon fire. Others stood still and grabbed hold of their pants to keep their hands from shaking. But not Robert Smalls. As the leader, Smalls knew he must remain calm. As they approached Fort Sumter, he pulled the whistle cord. He mimicked the code he had seen Captain Raylia use many times before, 2 long toots and 1 short one. The sentry on duty didn't see anything amiss with the planter. He yelled words of encouragement to Smalls, thinking he was part of the Confederacy, and let them pass. But minutes later, the soldiers noticed something unusual. The planter was going the wrong way. It was supposed to take supplies to Morris Island. Instead, the ship was sailing towards the Union fleet. Now the soldiers knew something was wrong. They tried to fire on Smalls and his crew, but the steamer was too far away. They signaled to Morris Island to fire, but those cannons were also out of firing range. The Confederate soldiers could do nothing but watch as the planter sailed toward the Union ships. The runaways finally let their shoulders drop. Some wept with relief. Others danced, prayed, or sang. But they quickly ended their celebration. Their dangerous journey was not yet over. Smalls knew they could easily be mistaken for Confederate troops. He ordered the Confederate and South Carolina flags lowered as they approached the Union ships. In their place, Smalls instructed his crew to raise a white bedsheet. This would signal their peaceful surrender. The Onward, a Union warship, sat ahead. The planter was headed directly for it. Aboard the Union ship, Captain John Frederick Nichols called out to his crew, "All hands to quarters!" He planned to destroy the enemy ship before it destroyed his own. The fog had helped Smalls earlier, but it was not helping now. The morning haze made it difficult for the Union soldiers to see the white flag. They couldn't tell that the men on board the planter were not enemy soldiers. The Onward crew could only see that there was a warship headed toward them. It was coming from enemy territory. Roughly 100 Union sailors on the Onward were now awake. They raced to their battle stations. The Union soldiers aimed their cannons towards the planter. They waited for Nichols to give the order. On the planter, Smalls and his crew screamed and cried out. They had made it past the Confederate forts, but were about to be killed by the Union Navy. The men, women, and children huddled together on the deck and prayed. Just as Nichols was about to command his crew to attack, he caught a glimpse of the white flag through the fog. He ordered his men to stand down. The wheelman steered the planter alongside the Onward. Smalls shouted, "Good morning, sir! I brought you some of the old United States guns, sir!" For a few moments, the planter crew was frozen. Then it hit them. They were out of danger. Joy broke out among the crew and the passengers. "Hallelujah!" one of the women shouted. A group of men jumped and danced. A child who'd fallen asleep during the adventure woke to happy shouts and songs of merriment. Smalls looked over the exuberant crew and smiled. His heart beat loudly and proudly. He had done it. Freedom at last. To learn more about Robert Smalls, who went on to become the first Black U.S. Navy captain, as well as a U.S. congressman, continue reading. The end. To find The Escape of Robert Smalls, visit your local library. That's all for now. Bye-bye. Till next time.